In attempting to understand what distinguishes joint actions from parallel but merely individual actions, I've been offering a simple theory. According to the simple theory, you and I perform an intentional joint action exactly when there's some act type, such as cycling to school together, such that each of us intends that we, you and I, cycle to school together, and our intentions are appropriately related to our actions. Now, what I've suggested to you is that the simple theory has this kind of virtue, right? There's nothing really novel or special here. We've just got a particular kind of intention. So if you thought the standard solution to the problem of action in the individual case was good, the simple theory is this kind of natural and attractive way of getting some joint action into the picture as well. No need for some complicated structure or some conceptual or normative innovation, right? We don't need group minds or anything like that. Now, of course, nobody thinks that the simple theory has a chance of being true, but it seems to me important that we understand why it fails in order to justify going on to those more complicated theories. And indeed, if you look at the literature in philosophy, I'm not sure that you're going to find a clear and convincing demonstration that the simple theory is false. Correct me if I'm wrong. So let's start by looking at what I take to be the most important attempt to refute something like the simple theory. So what Bratman has in mind isn't articulated as the simple theory. That's my formulation, so it's a little bit unfair to put his mafia case against it. But it's not entirely unfair, because I think this is the sort of view that he wants to attack. And so Bratman's mafia case is supposed to provide a counterexample for our purposes to the simple theory. And it involves this situation. I intend that we, you and I, go to New York City together, and you intend that we, you and I, go to New York City together, right? So it looks like the thing that the simple theory requires is going to be met, but there is a twist, right? So Bratman imagines that we are actually mafiosi, is that the right term? Anyway, we're involved in some kind of criminal underworld. And so your intention is that we, you and I, go to New York City together by way of you forcing me into the back of my car. So you're going to force me into the back of my own car and then drive me to New York. So it's true that you intend that we go to New York together, but you do not intend that we go to New York by way of my intention that we go to New York. Not at all. Your intention is that we do this by way of forcing me into the back of the car. And so Bratman says, look, because of this kind of problem, we have to have conditions that require intentions concerning each other's intentions. So we add a layer of complexity. But should we draw that moral from exactly this case? I think we should hesitate here, because the simple theory requires not just that you and I have these intentions, but that they be appropriately related to our actions. So here's the dilemma in response to the mafia case objection. If I'm defending the simple theory, I should say, look, if you act on this intention, right, and you succeed, then my intention that we go to New York City together will not be appropriately related to my actions. So that won't be something that meets the conditions of the simple theory, right? It won't meet the appropriately related condition. On the other hand, right, if you have this intention, but then you turn up and you realize that I'm perfectly willing to go to New York City with you anyway, then your having had this intention doesn't seem to be playing any special role. So although now the conditions of the simple theory are met, it doesn't really seem like there's any obstacle to this being a case of intentional joint action. Why wouldn't it be? Okay, you came here with a pretty nasty intention. You didn't envisage us performing a joint action because you didn't think that my actions would be appropriately related to my intention that you and I go to New York City together. But in the end they were, so it's all good. So it looks to me like we can't use the mafia case to get rid of the simple theory. I mention this because it illustrates something else which is interesting. If you read Michael Bratman on this argument, it seems clear that implicitly he is assuming that whatever conditions we impose on the intentions and other mental states of the agent must somehow be such that those mental states are not compatible with anything other than a joint action. Right? So it has to be somehow that the mental states being properly realized just guarantee that there will be an intentional joint action. But I can't think, and he never says that, so maybe he doesn't think that, but I think it must be implicit in the way that he presents this example. right? So I think what he really doesn't like about the simple theory is that you can have intentions, like this one, which are not really compatible with there eventually being a joint action, and yet still go on and perform a joint action because circumstances change and those intentions are never activated. Now my suggestion is, look, this is a mistake. What we need from a theory about intentional joint action is not a bunch of mental states that somehow guarantee that either the mental states fail or there will be a joint action, an intentional joint action. It's enough for the intentional joint action to be a consequence both of the contents of the mental states and of the way they're related to the actions. And of course that's something which is very much in line with Bratman's eventual theory. So there may be room here to beef up the mafia case to show that we have a problem. But my strategy will be rather to try to find a different counterexample based on it. So the next one is going to involve walking together rather than going to New York City together, because this is a tiny bit easier. What I want to do is to try to remove from the mafia example the fact that two people have these intentions, but then one person's intention just doesn't play any role because they get put into the trunk of a car. So what we're going to do is to walk together in the Tarantino sense. I'm going to intend that we, you and I walk together, and you're going to intend that we, you and I walk together. But you and I are both these gangster types. So my intention that you and I walk together involves me forcing you to walk at gunpoint. So I whip out my gun, I point it at your head and I say, let's walk. But as things happen, right, you do exactly the same at the same time, as it turns out. So you whip out your gun and you point it at my head and you simultaneously say, let's go for a walk. And we're kind of like, okay, good, this is good, right? And we're locked together at gunpoint. This is walking together in the Tarantino sense. And it gives us an objection to the simple theory of joint action. The thought is this: now all of the conditions of the simple theory are met. It's not just that we have these intentions, but these intentions are appropriately related to our actions, admittedly involving guns as well, but still the intentions are causing the actions. And yet, walking together in the Tarantino sense shouldn't count as an intentional joint action, at least not unless the central events of Reservoir Dogs count as joint action. So there's the objection to the simple theory. And when I presented the objection to the simple theory before, I was most surprised to find that philosophers, even very experienced philosophers, objected to the objection. So they replied on behalf of the simple theory, not because they had any particular concern with the simple theory or liked the simple theory, but they replied to the objection by saying, look, walking together in the Tarantino sense is an intentional joint action as much as any other. The presence of the guns is just kind of irrelevant, right? It doesn't really matter what holds our intentions together. So what they suggested in effect was, look, the guns are a kind of distraction to make this thing seem nasty, but lots of joint action is pretty nasty, and there's nothing wrong with there being nasty elements here. Now, I've got to tell you that I don't know anymore whether we should think about this as intentional joint action or not. And indeed, what this experience pointed me to is a real concern about the threat that the whole discussion might collapse, because we might just turn out to be trading intuitions or guesses, and there might be quite significant diversity in the intuitions we have about which cases are which. So think about what we've done. We introduced the fundamental question, what distinguishes joint action from parallel but merely individual action, by giving some contrast cases. And you were supposed to nod along with the contrast cases and say, Steve, yep, this is joint action, that's parallel but merely individual, right? Sisters cycling together, joint action. Strangers cycling side by side, merely parallel. And you were supposed to nod through all those examples. And you're supposed to be able to go on and give these other examples. And you're supposed to be able to say, Steve, walking together side by side in the ordinary way, that's fine, that's joint action. Tarantino sense, that's parallel but merely individual, or whatever. We're supposed to be able to come up with a view on this and these kind of cases. And it may be that there isn't really anything fundamental or deep behind the fact that we can do that, right? So it may be that all we end up really doing here is trading intuitions. And that's not something that we should be doing as philosophers. Organising intuitions, absolutely fine to do that on weekends and evenings, but it really shouldn't be part of your day job. So although this experience alerted me to that, I also want to just plough on, right, and see if I can come up with another counterexample. So here I really want to pursue a kind of dual strategy. So on the one hand, I want to carry on pursuing the method of counterexamples and contrast cases and see where we get with that. And on the other hand, I just want to be alert to the possibility that that whole thing is going to collapse and maybe we're going to need a fundamentally different approach. But let's pursue both of those things simultaneously. So here's a third attempt to provide an objection to the simple theory of joint action. And it's this third attempt, I think, which is most likely to succeed. And it involves a story where you are on an aeroplane. And you're on an aeroplane and there's a very, very noisy hen stag party on the plane by a bunch of people. And it emerges that the members of this party have a very tight connection. So they have to make this very tight connection. And they've been kind of really noisy. They've kept you up the whole night on this flight. They've been very inconsiderate. They've been rude to the people serving them. They've been rude to the people around them and so on. And you're kind of like, you know, feeling a bit malicious, right? And I think it's because you've been awake all night. So normally you'd be a much nicer person, but I have to imagine that you're really kind of quite a nasty person now. So you turn to your friend next to you and you give them a kind of a nudge. And you just step out into the aisle and you and your friend, by this kind of prior agreement, spend a long time, you know, just trying to ease this suitcase down from the thing and so on. And if it wasn't that you were both blocking the aisle, the party behind you could kind of sneak around you and get off the plane. But just by kind of performing this very, very slow, difficult action, bending down, tie up your shoelace, apologizing, oh, I'm so sorry I bumped you, and just really dithering and slowing there, you're kind of generating a lot of stress. Now, of course, you don't want them to actually miss their flight, but you do want them to kind of just suffer a little bit. So I would say here's a paradigm case of intentional joint action. You and your friend blocking the aisle by prior agreement is an intentional joint action. Contrast that with the second case. Now in the second case, you're on the plane by yourself. You have the same experience with the hen and stag parties behind you and you have the same malicious idea, but there's no one that you're with. However, you do see a person in the aisle next to you and you think to yourself, gosh, you know, that person is very likely to move for a while. So what I'm going to do, using the prediction that that person will stay where they are, my intention is that that person and I, block the aisle together. So I'm going to go up and stand next to her and I'm going to spend a long time fiddling with my luggage and so on. And because I predict that she's going to stay there, that will enable us, she and I, to block the aisle together. Right? So we will be blocking the aisle together. But she isn't actually intending to do that as far as I'm aware. She's just standing there. And the other person, unbeknown to you, has exactly the same kind of intention. So when you turn up and stand beside them, that other person thinks, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to stand here. And I believe that other person is going to stay here. I predict that. I don't think that other person has any intention to block the aisle, but I intend that she and I block the aisle together by means of me standing here and doing a lot of luggage performance while that person was going to stand here anyway. So you see how this is working now. We have a situation where you are blocking the aisle together. Each of you intends that you too block the aisle together, and those intentions are appropriately related to your action. It doesn't seem like this can really be an intentional joint action because each of you thinks of the other person merely as an opportunity to exploit. The other person is merely providing a bit of bulk that could also equivalently be provided by an immovable piece of furniture that just doesn't happen to be there. So to regard this as an intentional joint action seems wrong, but the conditions of the simple theory of joint action are met. So here's the objection. The sisters blocking the aisle perform an intentional joint action, whereas the strangers are acting in parallel, but merely individually. That's the claim. In both cases, the conditions of the simple theory are met. That's by construction. So although you might want to reject one, you can't reject two because that's just how I constructed the case. It follows from those two things that the simple theory does not correctly distinguish between joint actions and parallel but merely individual actions. So at last we have an objection to the simple theory of joint action. If you think this is a good objection, you now have some justification to go on and consider the more complicated theories of joint action. And there the natural thing to do would be to start with Michael Bratman's because his is the best defended theory and it's also a theory to which there is no good objection that has been published in writing. On the other hand, if you think that this objection doesn't work, then you need to find some other way to rule out the simple theory of joint action in order to motivate considering further contenders. So when I first started trying to find objections to the simple theory to motivate considering Bratman, I thought it would be quite easy to do. And it turned out that audiences have confounded me over the years that I've been trying to do that, because there is always a few people who quite reasonably object to my counterexamples. So I'm quite interested to know what you think about whether this is really a counterexample, and it may well be that if I get a chance to teach this course again in the future, I'm going to be having to think up more counterexamples in order to move the discussion on, or perhaps just move straight to a different approach. But for now, I'm going to take it that it really is a counterexample. So I'm going to add to my contrast cases the contrast between two friends blocking the aisle in accordance with a prior agreement to do so, and two strangers blocking the aisle, where each of the strangers is merely exploiting the other's bulk in order to block the aisle, or so they think. But as it happens, each agent intends that they, the two people, block the aisle, right, together. So what this tells me is that the conditions of the simple theory of joint action can be met, even in a case where people are performing a parallel but merely individual action, and therefore that we have to, by our own standards, reject the simple theory because it cannot answer the question, what distinguishes joint actions from merely parallel actions? It is time for us to consider a less simple theory.